On today's episode, we reveal our ladder prediction for the rest of the season, what moves do the Eagles need to make, and we take a look at the coaching market. All that and more on today's episode of Zero Hanger TV. All right, so straight into it. We've crunched the numbers and we've done our ladder predictor for the rest of the season. Mitch, who have we got? Top four.
Well, yeah, 81 games left, 9 rounds, and we went into it blindly as well. So we just went through each game. We didn't have to have a focus on a single club, and it's spat out. To little surprise, Collingwood taking out a minor premiership, which would be their 20th. I think they've already got a couple more than any other club. So another minor premiership for the Pies, according to the predictions that we put in. Now that we're at the end of the bye rounds, Port Adelaide, who are probably that rivaling contender at the top. Both clubs currently tied as well at the moment, just separated by percentage. But we do have Port, I think, a win or two behind the Pies come the end of the year. Some big games, and one of them being between those two clubs in the last 9 rounds. And then in second and third, again, maybe to no surprise, I think we've got Melbourne and then Brisbane to round out the top 4. So those 4 clubs are getting those home finals and those second chances that everyone's kind of after come September.
Yeah. And the next 4, so bottom of the 8?
Yeah, this was a bit of a surprise. So like I said, we kind of just got the whole 1 to 18 at the end, and then we had Adelaide in 5th. So that's a really, really good mark for them, given where they were probably placed at the start of the year. I certainly didn't have them in the top 8. So if they do end up 5th, that's a massive tick for Matthew Nix's men, and whether they can go a step further and at least win a final. And obviously, 5th spot will get you a home final. Next 2, Geelong and Essendon, so those 2 would play off in that 6th versus 7th elimination final. So the Cats coming up. They've got obviously a suite of games at GMHBA, some against some big contenders, but if they're to knock off some of those clubs, that'll certainly have them in that top 6 bracket. Essendon just behind them, kind of staying in that bottom 4 of the top 8, and then the Western Bulldogs in 8th. So that overall will mean that 1 change to the top 8. So Geelong currently outside, the Saints are currently inside, and the Saints are one of our big sliders from across the last 9 rounds.
Yeah. And in the unlucky bracket, so Dockers just missing out?
Yeah, so I guess what it's spat out as well is that Fremantle only just miss out on a top 8 spot from percentage. They've got a pretty low percentage from here, and then what we had at the end of round 24. So just missing out on percentage to the Western Bulldogs for that top 8 spot. A bit of a tail there for Rory Lobb, obviously, with how things have gone this year. But those 2 clubs will also play off in round 16. So that's going to be one of those deciding games to kind of see how this ladder takes shape. Another one just behind the Dockers was Richmond, who only 2 points off a top 8 spot. I think their percentage is probably just as strong as the Bulldogs. So that draw in round 1 could become costly in a way if they do fall just 2 points off. So those 2 clubs in the Dockers and Tigers, plus, as we mentioned before, St Kilda with being big sliders, are probably the 3 unlucky clubs when it comes to that finals frame.
Yeah. And who do we have holding on to the first pick?
No surprise, I don't think, especially off how the weekend went and kind of running through the rest of their season. West Coast aren't really expected to win another game. Now they'll host North Melbourne in a few weeks' time at Optus Stadium. That'll be probably their best chance and maybe only chance really to chalk up a second win of the year, but we don't see them doing so, and they'll end the year with a 1-22 record, which is obviously pretty dismal for how they're going. But 171 point loss on the weekend kind of shows exactly where they're at. And then just above them, North Melbourne with a couple wins. I think they get 1 more at the end of the season. That's the one coming over West Coast. And then Hawthorn, I think they'll knock off another win as well, and that one's coming over North Melbourne. So those 3 clubs can still be plenty of movement, and a couple of them playing each other is going to certainly decide that.
Yeah, good stuff. All right, so we'll check back in at the end of the year to see how our prediction went.
Yeah.
All right, so moving on to, not really moving on, but basically, what are we going to do with the West Coast? So they had one of the worst droppings that we've seen in a decade almost since that Melbourne and Geelong game down at Keating Park. I have pretty bad memories of that, and I saw it again on the weekend with the West Coast falling to Sydney for.
Contrastingly, I had very good memories of that game. So that's always a good one to bring up. The 4th biggest loss in the competition's history. A really, really tough day for West Coast. Their darkest day by some margin, you'd think. The questions obviously get raised on where they go to next. The first person whose name kind of gets brought into the crossfires Adam Simpson, and I was really happy to see, although the statement was, just to kind of echo what we've said all year, that they're backing him in, and the strategy that they've got in place. They know that they want high-end draft talent. It's going to be a long process, and they've got Adam Simpson as the man to do that. He's contracted for 2 more years as well. What kind of payout they'd have to be forced into if they wanted to part ways with him is another thing. And on top of that, how does he feel about the job is the other thing. He's what he's going through at the moment is obviously not easy. And then, he'll maybe get a break at the end of the year is what was flagged a few months ago. But I think for the first few moves or changes that need to be made at the club are outside of Adam Simpson and some of the pieces that are surrounding him.
Mm-hmm. And so we're predicting they're going to end up with the number 1 pick.
Yep.
So what do we think we're going to do with the number 1 pick? Do they trade it or do they hold on to it?
Yeah, probably one will break down a bit further in the next couple of weeks, but I'm an advocate that they trade it, as well as Harley Reid's going to be, and as great of a talent he is, and as well as West Coast need the best draft talent possible. I'd love to see them, and I think it is going to be doable to see them split pick 1 into 3 first round selections, given the demand and the discussion around Harley Reid. So there's a number of clubs that have multiple first round picks for this year, and then obviously those clubs will have their first rounders for next year as well. So Melbourne, GWS, I think the Western Bulldogs have got a couple. So there's clubs that can put in those kind of bids, and I'd like to think if West Coast are open to it, that they would be trying to pull in 3 first round picks, ideally 2 in the top 10, and then 1 between that 10 to 18 mark. There's 3 WA kids, Colin Thelstrup, Mitch Edwards, and Dan Curtin, 3 guys that offer really differing traits and abilities. We got a ruckman in there. You've got this, I guess, exciting forward flanker, and then you've got a player who can stand out in the back line as a forward and through midfield in Dan Curtin. So they can get those 3 in return, 3 local kids, just like they did with Elijah Hewitt and Ruben Jimby. I think they would be much happier with that. Harley Reid's going to be a great talent for wherever he goes, but I would like to see, I guess, West Coast kind of moving down the other direction.
Yeah, interesting stuff. So a lot to do for West Coast at the moment.
Plenty to think about.
Yeah. All right. Moving over to our rookie rankings, and we finally have a little bit of movement from the top 2 spots, but they've just swapped places.
Yeah. Well, this week, as we mentioned last few weeks, after the bye rounds, we'll be extending it to 8, and that's what we've done. And 7 of those spots have seen movement, and the biggest one being Harry Sheasel being knocked off his throne. He's been there since round 1 at the number 1 spot, and we now see Will Ashcroft moved into that number 1 spot. We kind of flagged it last week, given that Ashcroft really just needed to have a strong enough performance, or a pretty much a performance we've come to expect from him. And he did so against St Kilda, and that's seen Harry Sheasel fall 1 spot, just given he had the bye. So that gap, as close as it was the week before between Sheasel and Ashcroft, is just as close, only this time Ashcroft is on top. Bailey Humphrey's the one man that stays in that same spot on the podium at number 3. Max Michael only comes up 1, Ruben Jimby goes down 1. And then we got 2 new faces for this week. So Seamus Mitchell back into the rookie rankings. He fell out from his bye week and technically, I guess, replaces Mateus Filippo. George Waller falls back 1 because he had a bye week. And then that 8th spot now open goes to Matt Johnson, who another one we've talked about in recent weeks. And he had a pretty strong performance on Saturday night against Essendon.
Yep. And the honourable mentions?
So a couple. Judd McVee's been one I think we've probably mentioned a fair bit. He was actually in the rankings, I think, across the first few rounds when we only had, I think, 5 or 6 spots up for grabs. So he's one. Cam McKenzie, I thought was decent enough in what was a difficult game for the Hawks. And another one, in probably a similar tone, Elijah Hewitt. It's not much that was a positive for the Eagles, but just from a player who's coming back into the side in his first year, I thought he was among the very few shining lights for Adam Simpson's side.
Yeah, well, at least there's some, right? Yeah. All right, so moving over to the coaching market, and Damien Hardwick has hinted already that he might be interested in another coaching job.
Yeah, so he spoke on the Dylan Friends podcast about how he's kind of already missing coaching. You could probably expect that, but I guess the big question was really if he's going to come back, and he says he does see himself doing so at some stage, and even he wasn't too sure if that would be for next year or kind of just tread water next year, as some coaches do. We know what Alistair Clarkson kind of did throughout 2022. He was tied to just about every job that opened up, and then eventually was able to pounce on the North Melbourne job at the end of the season. So whether Hardwick does the same next year, or could be doing it right now. He's going over to Europe, then he'll come back and he'll assess those options. So he's an interesting one, and I think the first job that kind of comes to mind is the Gold Coast job, which is obviously quite unfair on Stuart Dew. He's contracted. I'd love to see him see out that job, but the role at the Suns is, I think, arguably the one I would want to have most. I think you've got great backing from the AFL. You've got such a great list with the talent they've got on hand, and they've also got 3 top 20 picks coming through their academy guys. So Jake Rogers, Ethan Reid, and the big one being Jed Walter, who's pretty much a bona fide top 5 pick, big bustling key forward. So you add those 3 into the mix for what you're already trying to build at the Suns, and they're currently outside the 8 on percentage. So all that mix would certainly have Stuart Dew wanting to hold on to this job as much as he can, but how someone like Damien Hardwick looks at that is always going to be quite interesting. And then the other conversation is Ken Hinkley as well. He's another one that we won't really know till the end of the year, just like Hardwick. And whether he wants to stay at Port and whether Port wants to keep him is one thing. And then another thing is, if he does want to go, does he look at the Gold Coast job as well? So there's obviously a bit of a dynamic, and a lot of that is going to be concentrated on how Damien Hardwick and Ken Hinkley decide their futures come the end of the year.
Yeah, and then another side of that, obviously, who replaces Damien Hardwick? We've got McQualter, who's taking the interim coach role, but he could be a pretty good fit. They're doing pretty well.
Yeah, no, exactly. He's the type of coach that they want. So they want that next Damien Hardwick. They don't really want an experienced coach coming through. They kind of just want someone that can ease into the role, first-time coach that is not necessarily learning the ropes, but has been in the system for long enough. And Andrew McQualter obviously fits that bill. The Tigers are playing quite strongly under him. I don't think they'll rush into any decision until the end of the year, and they'll still go through a process. It'd be surprising to not have him as the favourite for the role at the moment. Who else would they go for? You look at maybe Melbourne, Troy Chaplin and Adam Uze are 2 that have always been floated. Justin Lepich, would he come back to the club? He kind of said the door might be a little open if he wants to consider it. Blake Carousel is another one that used to be there. And then among kind of those highly rated, untried assistants is another one, probably Jamie Graham, who's done fantastic work at West Coast and Fremantle. I think he was in the running for the Pies job when Craig McRae got it. So he's one that I think, might be looked toward if they open that pool up a fair bit.
Yeah, interesting stuff. All right. And to finish up, as always, we have the Zero Hanger MVP and a couple of buys to Toronto. We've got Bont and Butters and Petrarca with 8 votes on the top 3.
Yeah, so it was kind of a stagnant, I guess, top order. So the top 3 hasn't really changed. As you mentioned, Taranto, Bontempelli, both with buys, as did Zach Butters. Christian Petrarca polled 8 votes. So the Taranto, Bont and Petrarca order kind of stays the same. Butters drops down to 6, just given that both Dacos and Jordan Dawson polled really strongly in that game, that Sunday thriller at the MCG. So those 2 kind of pop up into those 4th and 5th spots. Zach Butters to 6th. So it kind of shakes up a little bit there, but it certainly tightens it a lot. There's only like 24 votes, I think, between first and the next few. So it's going to be quite close now that we hit the last 9 rounds of the season. A few others, Jack Sinclair, Lachie Neale split a fair few of the votes in kind of being second to Harris Andrews, who was easily the standout from that game. So those 2 are in the top 10. And at the same time, Noah Anderson rounds out the 10, Caleb Sarong at 11. Those 2 polled nicely over the weekend and have reached the 100 votes tally. So that's kind of where we sit now that we're outside of the buys, got a breath of fresh air, and we can look towards the home stretch.
Yeah, looking forward to how we're going to go after the buys. So that wraps it up for Zero Hanger TV today. Thanks, Mitch.
Thanks, Felix.
And don't forget to subscribe to the YouTube channel, and you can catch all the latest AFL news at zerohanger.com.